All synthetic systems eventually break down. Some systems are more robust than others, but they all eventually break. Civilization is a synthetic system. And just because modern civilization is massive and powerful does not make it an exception to this. The world as you know it can, and someday will, come to an end. This is an inevitable fact of reality. Let's get after it. I'm James Merritt, Emergency Manager and Career Soldier, and this is Readiness Nation. And today we're going to talk about what causes most of you to be interested in individual emergency management in the first place. The end of the world. Now, the end of the world comes in two distinct varieties: extinction events and collapse events. Extinction events are just what they sound like. Incidents of such destructive magnitude that they would outright exterminate Homo sapiens and probably most, if not all, other species on Earth. While collapse events are events that would end modern civilization and plunge the world into a second dark age, but ultimately are survivable for at least some of humanity. But the good news is that there's only a handful of things that in and of themselves are extinction-level events, meaning that the initial incident by itself is enough to murder our species. Think the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, or the sun going nova, or a large enough solar flare pointed directly at the Earth so that it literally boils the oceans. Maybe nuclear war, depending on the scope of the nuclear exchange and whether or not nuclear winter turns out to be real. But if people keep screwing around with gain-of-function research, something like airborne Ebola would probably get the job done. In these instances, there's nothing you can do. It doesn't matter how good your plan is. It doesn't matter what kind of training or resources you've acquired. You're just going to die. We're all going to die. It's an extinction event. So especially in the instances of the cosmological phenomena, set up a nice seat on your lawn, crack open your favorite adult beverage, and greet oblivion warmly. Collapse events, on the other hand, are what we're really here to talk about, because those are the ones you can survive if you understand them and you take the right actions. And to understand collapse events, you first need to understand that there are very few things that are destructive enough in magnitude to be able to collapse civilization outright, but then not be an extinction event. A weaponized electromagnetic pulse would be the most clear-cut example. A limited nuclear exchange of just the right magnitude could also thread the needle. Or a pandemic that's just deadly enough to crash the system, but then not deadly enough to be an extinction event. But all in all, it's a very short list. What's far more likely and has more potential vectors than you can count is civilizational collapse brought on by what we in emergency management call cascading effects. This is when the initial incident damages or destroys some capabilities within a society, and that initial damage puts increased strain on other load-bearing nodes within the society. As those nodes continue to try to function under the enhanced strain, some of them pop. This in turn puts more strain on the remaining nodes, and when they try to continue to function under this even greater strain, even more of them pop. This process continues until it's stopped by emergency management professionals or the whole civilization collapses. For the US, or any other developed country for that matter, the cascade becomes terminal when either too many of the people required to perform the critical tasks to physically sustain that civilization are killed, or there's so much economic damage that the economy of the country collapses. But in general, though, it would be a very peculiar set of circumstances under which the critical workers are dying off en masse before the collapse of the nation's economy and the subsequent disintegration of rule of law, the functioning of first responders and medical facilities, the functioning of utilities, and the functioning of local markets. Something like the aforementioned pandemic of just the right lethality could attrit the critical workforce over an extended period of time, such that it induces the cascading effects that could crash a civilization before its economy gives out. Additionally, some of the creeping doom scenarios we're going to discuss in future videos may pan out this way, but again, it's a short list of very peculiar circumstances that could cause this. The far more likely pathway to collapse is economic, because the adverse economic conditions are both fed by and drive multiple factors that exacerbate the situation. First, the damage from the initial incident and all subsequent damage from the cascading effects all just increase the cost of response and recovery, thus increasing the strain on the economic system. Furthermore, the degraded functionality of various civic nodes degrades the ability for economic activities to be conducted, meaning people are less capable of going to work and producing goods and services. meaning the economy is making less money to pay for the increasing costs of response and recovery. And the worse the effects get, the less productive the economy becomes. So the worse the incident gets and the longer it goes on, the more expensive it becomes and the less capable the country becomes to pay the bill. When you put this on top of the colossal deficit and debt the US already has, it wouldn't take long for the situation to become terminal. But either way you get there, the full collapse of a developed nation is bleak. In 2015, former CIA Director James Woolsey testified before Congress about a study they conducted into the impacts a weaponized EMP attack would have on the United States. There were two models developed to assess the impacts of such an attack. The first model found that 66% of the population would die off within the first year. The second model found that 90% of the population would die off within the first year. Given the fact that in the decade since these models were developed, the baby boomers have fully transitioned into retirement and are becoming increasingly reliant on medical care for their survival, coupled with the fact that Americans in general have become more reliant on advanced infrastructural systems than ever, I'm of the belief that the 90% figure is probably closer to the actual outcome. Furthermore, these models are an excellent proxy for any full collapse event, because very few people would die directly from the EMP. Only people on life support, people with pacemakers, or people on aircraft at the time of the attack would die as a direct result. The overwhelming majority of fatalities in these models come from all of the systems of our civilization failing to function, which would also happen in a full collapse event from any other cause. As such, I use the 90% fatalities within the first year statistic for any collapse event in all of my analysis on the subject. So when looking at what could actually cause a global collapse event, it's critical that you understand that the US is the central tent pole of modernity. If we go down, we're taking the whole tent down with us. The US is the center of global commerce, and as the saying goes, we've exported several recessions, but never imported one. We set the tempo for the global economy. Not only are we the world's largest economy, the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, and according to the Fed, accounts for about 60% of all foreign exchange reserves. Additionally, about 60% of international foreign currency liabilities and claims are denominated in US dollars. So international trade is overwhelmingly transacted within a US-dominated, if not outright controlled financial system, and transacted primarily in US dollars. Additionally, roughly 1/3 of US debt is held by foreign governments, central banks, and private entities. So if the US financial system collapses and the value of the US dollar falls to zero, more than $10 trillion worth of assets would disappear from balance sheets around the world. This would destabilize the economies and the currencies of every country on Earth. Furthermore, capital and credit would simply become unavailable worldwide, and international financial transactions would become extremely difficult, if not impossible. This would lead to a series of cascading effects within the economies and ultimately the civil systems of every developed nation on Earth. And in the end, they would all face the same fate as the US, fully collapsing, with 90% of their populations dying off within the first year. Developing countries won't fare much better just because they have less involvement with, and thus less dependence on, the global financial system. This is primarily due to the fact that, as prominent geopolitical analyst Peter Zion calculates, 75% of the world imports its food, and 70% of the world imports its fertilizer. With that in mind, remember, all of the top food exporters and several of the leading fertilizer exporters will have all gone through the aforementioned economic collapse. So food for sale, food aid, and fertilizer simply won't be available on the global market. But even if there somehow were food or fertilizer available on the global market, unless the buyer shares a border with the seller, there'd be no way for them to physically get it. And even if they do share a border, the global financial collapse will make the transaction exceedingly difficult. As discussed, capital and credit will no longer be available, meaning you have to have cash up front to buy anything. But there won't be any stable currencies anywhere on Earth anymore to facilitate the transaction. So you're probably going to need precious metals physically coming off of your trucks or your ships at the same time and place as your cargo goes on. These transactions would involve such risk that even if there were any insurance companies that didn't go bankrupt during the financial collapse, they assuredly would not underwrite such dodgy exploits. Which brings us to how physically dangerous trying to conduct trade would actually become. As it turns out, and I am loath to admit this as a career Army officer, but the whole world as you understand it is predicated on the US Navy. Since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 that took effect immediately following the conclusion of World War II, the US Navy has secured and provided for the free and open use of all global shipping lanes for commercial traffic. But the collapse of the United States means the disbanding of the US Navy, which means there's no longer a global shipping security guarantor. Which means any nation that wants to engage in international trade has to float their own navy to secure their own ships. Floating a blue water navy is one of the most expensive things a nation can endeavor to do. And with every developed economy on Earth in shambles, no one will be able to afford to do such a thing. So realistically, international trade will just stop being a thing for a generation or two. And the 75% of people who import their food and the 70% of people who import their fertilizer will get neither food nor fertilizer. And roughly 75% of the developing world will die off over the following 2 years in the most horrific famine the world has ever seen. With 90% of the developed world dying in the first year and 75% of the developing world dying off in the first 2 years, we're looking at a combined total of at least 6.24 billion people dying within 2 years of the collapse of the United States of America, and the entire world descending into a second dark age. This is the other side of the globalization coin, the inherent consequence of the world becoming small and flat. This is why I set up phases 3, 4, and 5 of the individual readiness framework the way that I did. Because if we're looking at a collapse event, you need someplace safe you can go. Making movement to this location, no matter how perilous things have become, is what phase 3 is about. Once there, you need to go into the strongest defensive posture you can muster for the first year while the 90% die off. This is what phase 4 is about. And the only way anyone's going to survive in the long term after a collapse event is if they can first engage in subsistence agriculture and then engage in agroeconomic development, because it's going to take decades, if not centuries, for us to build our way out of a dark age. And that's what phase 5 is about. Now, some viewers may be saying this sounds far-fetched, and to that I remind you that the collapse of the Roman Empire caused the first dark age. And in this modern globalized world, the US occupies a position of central influence that the Roman emperors could have only dreamed of. So what's really far-fetched is to believe that the collapse of the United States wouldn't cause the second dark age. And all of this has probably filled several other viewers with existential dread. Because yes, the end of the world is possible. And yes, it will be more horrific than you imagined. But the most important takeaway here is that it is actually survivable. And you don't need to be a superhero or even a special operations soldier to do it. You just need the right plan, supported by the right knowledge, skills, and resources. But anyone can do it. And that is what Readiness Nation is about. And that's going to be it for me. So if you found this information useful, give me the old controlled pair on the like and subscribe buttons. And if you found this information useful enough that you want to buy me a beer about it, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. If you're watching on YouTube and you're finding this channel useful, head on over to my companion channels Readiness Nation GQC and Readiness Nation Reacts to get all of my content. If you're watching on any other platform, all content will be uploaded to the Readiness Nation main channel. And with that said, until next time, this is James Merritt for Readiness Nation, reminding you to always be the master of your fate and the captain of your soul.